Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to see all of your faces here in person. And I was seeing your faces on Zoom, but now I'm just seeing myself. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see many people whom I know well here. It makes it a little bit easier. But I am feeling a slight tightness in my chest. Some would call that nerves. It's about here. And that's a large part of what I want to talk about today, is seeing those feelings. But first, I have a few skits that I came up with. I went through a few iterations of, like what I was going to talk about. I did a lot of writing, and I was pretty sure at first I was like, oh, I'm gonna type out my entire talk, and I typed maybe 10 pages, and I actually wrote a lot of stuff down. And I was like, okay, this is good to get my thoughts out on the page and get a good idea, but I don't want it to seem too mechanical. So I was like, well, I'm just gonna speak spontaneously for the most part. And I started to think about and develop a lot of what I wanted to say. And then I went on a 3-day meditation retreat. And then again, everything just kind of shifted and changed. And it's actually on that retreat that I came up with a few skits in my mind about. And so I thought I could act this out for you, these two little skits, and then maybe we could have a discussion, see what people think of them, how they interpret them. That sounds good. Okay.
Are you going to speak in your skit?
No, I will be silent.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be too complicated.
Not impossible, but.
Yeah, that's my first skit. My second one, a little bit more refined. Any thoughts? Tai Chi? No.
The first skit looked like you were dragging a bag, a heavy bag.
I was, yeah.
And it seemed like you pulled two things out of the bag, and then you decided to just leave the bag and go on with your life.
Yeah. Well, actually, the bag disappeared.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Stopped existing.
Your normal beginning. Oh, hear this now?
yeah, I thought I did have to carry it, but then I realized that there was no bag.
Mm.
It's all in my head. Anybody else have any interpretations? Anybody on Zoom? Maybe if they saw that, okay.
Is there anybody left on Zoom?
And then the second skit, it seemed like maybe you were boxed in by ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps even though there was limitation there, you found something there that was beneficial to you.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, I mean, I was in the box. Those are, I started it by thinking, right? There were forms that I was perceiving and feeling, and then I had certain preferences to some forms, and I had an aversion to another form. But continuing to think about these forms tended to restrict me. And so then I could observe my thoughts about these forms and just kind of let them go. It was when I really experienced my felts, or leaned into my felt experience of those forms, that they really dissolved, and it started to clear to open space. And so hopefully that's a good segue that we can keep in mind. But I'm going to segue into talking about concepts. This concept was the term was coined by an author. His name is John Wellwood. He wrote a book called The Psychology of Awakening. He was around and participated in the formation of the Naropa Institute with teachers such as Chogyam Trungpa. And he coined this term spiritual let's see. A lot of things that start with spiritual bypassing, right? And so this sense of spiritual bypassing is that oftentimes we practice our spiritual work and we go into these places that seem detached from the relative existence of our day-to-day life. But oftentimes we are very adverse to these problems that come up in our relational world, and we don't want to deal with them properly. So oftentimes we escape into a place that we can perceive as more absolute, or we can perceive it as more enlightened. I use air quotes with that word. And so we think we're in a separate space, but really we've been here all the entire time. And so we're trying to get away from our pain rather than feel our pain. And oftentimes this doesn't lead to a fully integrated experience in our daily life. And to me, the real spiritual work involves working out our relative problems, as opposed to staying and abiding in a state of mind that isn't integrated into the world around us. And I am certainly in a rather privileged position to be able to lean into my pain and lean into problems and work them out in a relative way. It takes a lot of courage to face our pain. But oftentimes people are suffering so much from their pain that they're not equipped and they don't have the foundation to be able to lean into it to work it out, so to speak. And so this aspect of spiritual bypassing can oftentimes, it's not necessarily bad, but it's not good either, but oftentimes it can be necessary in order to just give a sense of relief from our pain. And we see it commonly when people practice forms of Buddhist meditation, or escaping our thought patterns, and we're escaping identification, and we're escaping ego, and we go into these non-dual states of awareness. And we can abide there, but when we come back, it can often be very upsetting, because we are then yearning for a place that we used to be, into those non-dual spaces where things start to make sense, where we start to feel happy or content with the world. And so it's really interesting. Because no matter how far we go into a meditative state, when we come back, the ego structures tend to reform, and we start to reform a sense of self and other in a relative sense. I was watching a Buddhist monk speak about this subject, and he was talking about Buddhist meditation practice and he was also talking about peyote and other psychedelic substances. And he was talking about how these psychedelic substances like peyote or LSD or even alcohol can bring you to a space of relative non-duality, and it can bring you to a space of ease, but it wears off eventually, and we come back to our dualistic, separated world, and it's a world of pain. And we are often, it brings us more suffering oftentimes, because we want to be in those spaces, but we have to keep using substances to get there. And so he talks about shamatha meditation in the Tibetan tradition as the practice to cultivate this space of non-duality and to integrate it into our being and to bring it into the relational world. And so a large part of this talk, forgive my lengthy preface, is going to involve understanding the foundational teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, and then some of the Mahayana teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, which we actually find root within the Pali scriptures. And hopefully I can provide some theory and framework for these practices. So I actually want to read something. This text is the root of the Mahayana tradition. It's very short. It's what's known as the Heart Sutra. And the name of this sutra is very important. And it didn't always make sense to me until I really started to dive into the meaning of what was actually happening. The way it's written is the words aren't not necessarily logical. it doesn't necessarily make sense upon first reading. It more has to be integrated into a continual practice. But hopefully this can give some context to the greater talk, the greater points of the talk. The noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, while practicing the deep practice of prajna paramita, looked upon the 5 skandhas, and seeing they were empty of self-existence, said, "Here, Sariputra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness is form. The same holds for sensation and perception, memory and consciousness. Here, Sariputra, all dharmas are defined by emptiness, not by birth or destruction, purity or defilement, completeness or deficiency. Therefore, Sariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no memory, and no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, and no mind. No shape, no sound, no smell, no taste, no feeling, and no thought. No element of perception. From eye to conceptual consciousness, no causal link. From ignorance to old age and death, or end of causal link. From ignorance to old age and death, no suffering, no source, no relief, no path. No knowledge, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Therefore, Sariputra, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in prajna paramita, and live without walls of the mind, and thus without fears. They see through delusion, and finally nirvana. All Buddhas, past, present, future, also take refuge in prajna paramita, and realize unexcelled perfect enlightenment. You should therefore know the great mantra of prajna paramita, the Mahavidya mantra, the unexcelled mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, which heals all suffering and is true, not false. The great mantra in prajna paramita, spoken thus: Gate, gate, paragate, parasamgati, bodhisattva. And that mantra somewhat translates to gone, gone, gone to the other shore, right? So one of the first points that I want to highlight in this talk is in the beginning of the sutra, it mentions the 5 skandhas. And so these 5 skandhas are, an understanding of the 5 skandhas is really necessary for understanding the roots of the Buddhist teachings on emptiness and also on compassion. And it's related to this. Well, this is the Bhavatraka, but we'll talk about that more in a second. And so these 5 skandhas are really a way of understanding, sort of a map of understanding the way we conceive of the world, the way an ego is formed, a sense of separate identification that we hold is formed from the rest of the world. And so the skandhas, really it starts with open space. There's just a lot of open space without any likes or dislikes, preferences about the world. And then the skandhas, they go into form, feeling, perception, conception, and consciousness. And they're all happening at once, but the Buddhists really have done a beautiful job at dividing and identifying these separate stages of ego development. And so we see first in form is we start to see the forms, we start to see things as separate. And the author and teacher Chogyam Trungpa, he described it as if we were a large pile of sand, basically. And then all of a sudden, one of the grains of sand woke up and started to think it was separate from the larger context and pile of sand. And so we start to see form, we start to see the shapes that we're moving around in the world. Start to see corners and whatnot. Feeling, and we start to feel these forms. We start to feel texture. And some of these textures, when we start perceiving it, we start to feel them as nice. Some things feel very soft, some things feel very pleasant to us, but some things also feel very unpleasant to us. They feel painful. We don't like that. And so we start to form conceptions about the world around us. We start to say, oh, well, this over here, I like this. So I'm going to get more of this. I am going to get more of this and bring it closer to me. Other things really they don't feel good at all. So we say, let's just go way over there. We don't want it anywhere close to me. And so we start to conceive and form preferences about the world around us. And all of this can be seen as consciousness. And so this whole process is meant to elucidate. It helps convince us that we somehow exist independently of the rest of the world. But really, we're not existing independently of the rest of the world. Our sense of self and our sense of I is conditioned by these experiences of like and dislike. And so we see that as the general framework for karma. Karma means actions. And it's quite interesting in karma is a word that gets thrown around a lot in our Western collective consciousness. We look at the Sanskrit, it generally just means action. And some have interpreted this as a form of determinism. If I do something, then obviously there's a reaction to that thing. And that's generally the case. If we go back to the Pali of the original Buddhism, we see that it's not necessarily thought of in the sense of the external world. It's more in relation to the inner world, into our mind states, into our modes of consciousness that we carry throughout the day. That's where our identifications are held. And if I do certain things now, in the future, it will give birth to different mind states. It's really when we start to see the Mahayana movement of Buddhism, which is the popular form of Buddhism today, when we see that developed, is when, and especially when it comes over to the West and it starts to integrate with the rational philosophers such as Descartes, who conceived of the world as very mechanistic, and philosophers such as that we start to see an interpretation of karma as a form of determinism. But that is more of a side note. Can you pull up the thingy? Can everyone on Zoom see that okay? We won't hear them, right? They're all muted. That's a good point. Okay, I'm sure they'll see it, yeah. Yes, okay, cool. Oh, Melissa, good to see you. So this is what's known as the Bhava chakra. Andrew, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you know what bhava means?
Bhava is in the Sanskrit root of bhuv, which means to become or to be. So it's the wheel of becoming.
The wheel of becoming, right? Right. So in a way, this is this image right here is well, this is said to be what the Buddha saw upon reaching enlightenment. And many practitioners of Buddhism, they look at this and they contemplate it in order to understand the nature of cyclic existence. I'm doing my best not to throw out too many foreign terms, but I don't necessarily know the context of what everyone is familiar with in Buddhism. But generally speaking, the word samsara means cyclic existence, and it's a state of suffering that we perpetuate unknowingly. The other side of the polarity of samsara is nirvana. And if we look at the Sanskrit, this literally means to extinguish, as in we're blowing out a candle flame. I think that's really cool. Because we ask what's being extinguished. We remember the skandhas. The skandhas are a process of the formation of our identifications of ego, a sense of self that's separate from the rest of the world. And that samsara, and that's samsara, is we're seeing things as separate from ourselves. We're perpetuating a belief in an independently existing self. And so if this is being extinguished, if we've attained nirvana, then a sense of self has been extinguished that's separate from everything else. And this is, I'm speaking very generally, because there's many different interpretations of Buddhism. There's many different schools. There's vast commentaries on everything, and it would be impossible to give credit to every single interpretation. This is mostly my understanding of it. And so if we dissect the Bhava Chakra, we can really start to see more of the nuances and intricacies of our own inner workings and how we perpetuate this sense of individual self separate from the rest of the world. We start in the center. I'll start in the center. I won't necessarily talk too heavily about this outer layer. That these are the 12 links of dependent origination, and they really trace each step very meticulously in the chain of samsara. And the Buddha, his whole idea was that he's going to reverse the chain. He's going to go back up the chain of the manifestation of self, and he's just going to reverse the entire process until there is no self. But so if we look at the center here, we can see a rooster, a snake, and a pig or boar. He looks like a boar, but when I read about it, he's usually labeled as a pig. And these are symbolic of a few different things. They're what's known as the three poisons. And these poisons are mainly, sometimes they get translated differently, but they're mainly anger, greed, and delusion. And this anger, greed, and delusion tends to get perpetuated by what's called avidya. And avidya in Sanskrit means ignorance, whereas vidya would mean knowledge. And this avidya is something that we tend to develop. It's an ignorance of our true and natural states of Buddha nature. In the Mahayana, we teach that enlightenment is fairly simple. We're all already enlightened. It's just generally hard for us to see it because, well, we get caught up in narratives in our mind. We get caught up in creating stories and conceiving about the world. And so it's hard for us to see the light within our being, the Buddha nature, so to speak. And so that's generally what we're ignorant of, is our own inherent self-worth. And when we don't see that, and we start to conceive about the world as separate from ourselves, we tend to be greedy, we tend to be angry about things, we tend to be delusional, we tend to react to our environment rather than respond to it. And this can often perpetuate a lot of pain and suffering, which is what we see here in the next circle, actually. We see good and bad karma. No matter how we speak of it, karma is its cyclic existence. As long as we're generating karma, we're still in samsara. And so we see this good and bad karma that we perpetuate, and really we are the cause of it. We have to take responsibility for our own suffering. And this karma that we generate propels us into what is called the six Buddhist realms. And these 6 Buddhist realms, it's really fascinating to me. I'm sort of working this out at the moment because I'm taking a class right now that explores the development of Buddhist modernity, how we understand it in the West. And it would seem that past Buddhist teachers and practitioners saw these realms as real ontological states of existence. But the way that they were taught by Buddhist teachers from Asia in West and in America, especially by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, is that these were mind states. They were psychological states of mind. And so we see that there's six Buddhist realms of being. We have the God's realm. We have the jealous God's realm, or the Asura's realm. We have the human realm, the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. And in some tantric texts, there are different qualities of karma that we generate. And so there's lesser forms of karma that project our consciousness into these different mind states. And then there's greater forms of karma, usually more subtle, nuanced forms of karma that supposedly put us into a real ontological realm that is one of these realms. But I don't really care about those realms right now, those supposed otherly existing realms. I'm more worried about right now, what's going on right now. And that's generally what the Buddha taught about. He said, don't worry about gods. Don't worship these gods. Forget about the gods. Worry about your life. We'll worry about how you're interacting with the world and how you're treating other beings. I think that's really special, because that's totally different than what we would usually call a religion. Which, the term religion is something that Western academia has labeled Buddhism, but it's not necessarily an accurate description of what Buddhism is. But again, getting away from that, another side tangent, these Buddhist realms, they're very real. We're in them all the time, and they're switching, they're constantly changing within our own psychological experience. And to the people experiencing these realms, it's extremely real. But at the same time, it's illusory. It's not real. It's fake. It's a trick. And so just give a brief description of each of these realms. We have the God's realm. This is an interesting realm because first hearing of this realm, it's like, oh, I want to be in the God realm. I want to be a god. That's cool, right? Yeah. But this realm of the gods is more descriptive of a state of pride, a state of spiritual pride, more specifically. And it's related to, it is related to spiritual pride because one of the ways that can often come about is through practice. And if we're constantly doing the same spiritual practice, we can start to identify it. We can start saying that, oh, I'm doing this practice. Look at how much experience I have in this practice. And so it can often cause a little bit of a detached, there's often there's something going on that doesn't let us perceive that it's a practice meant to help us observe the spaces in between our narratives and our thoughts, when really what we're doing when we're being prideful about a practice is we're creating another narrative about it. We're doing our best with these practices to dissolve these karmic states of existence, to get to more of an ontological state of being. And ontological, I mean, ontology is knowledge about being, as opposed to epistemology, which be thinking about knowledge. So generally, I conceive epistemology as relating to these narratives that we form in our head, whereas ontology is being. It's right here. It's very real. It's away from these constrictive narratives that we form. So we have the God's realm. The jealous God's realm is usually a state of suspicion. We think that there's something around the corner. It's hard to trust people in this state. We think that those we're interacting with, we think that there's an ulterior motive behind them interacting with us. And so it's hard. It can be hard for us to trust. The human realm. This is a realm that's very, say dualistic, dividing. It's very preference based. The next realm we see is the animal realm. I'm sure this is a fairly easy realm to understand. For most people, we just have to look at animals. It's very reactionary to our environment. There's not a lot of higher functions that are influencing our decision making. The next realm we see is the hungry ghosts realm. This is generally a state of greed, a state of wanting. And generally, the more that we get of that thing, the more we're going to want of it. And then the next realm is the hell realm. The hell realm is a state of, well, it's hot in hell, right? There's fire all around. It's very hot. And so that is supposed to symbolize the heat of anger that we feel. And if you guys can see this picture, all right, I don't know if everyone can. Is it generally viewable? Yeah. We can see some of these realms. In the animal realm. Maybe this is the hungry ghost realm. And so we're constantly being propelled into these different epistemological states of being. different narratives and conceptions are formed about the world. And this is generally the state of samsara that we see in Buddhism. How's everyone doing? Well, I'm not boring everyone too much. No? Okay. Cool.
Not in the boring realm.
Not in the boring, right? Yeah, well, that's good. So we have this general theory, this general framework for Buddhism, for samsara, for the realm of suffering. And so now I'd like to talk about a few of the practices that have been developed over centuries to help us see these realms for what they are and to hopefully get out of them in some way, whether that be temporary or not. And so this is more where we're looking at from a very Tibetan perspective. I know the Tibetan perspective more intimately than I do any other, really. I've practiced Zen, but the theory around it comes from a Tibetan place. And so in Tibet, we have three vehicles for the teachings. The first one is the Hinayana school or vehicle of teachings, and this means a small vehicle when you look at it literally. And at times it has been taken as a somewhat of a derogatory word to talk about other schools of Buddhism who only practice the foundational teachings of Buddhism. But really, when we're speaking of the Hinayana, we really do just mean the foundational teachings of the Buddha. And when we say Hinayana, it's within the context of Tibetan Buddhism. We're not referring to, say, the Theravada school of Buddhism when we say Hinayana. When we mean Theravada, I mean Theravada. But when I say Hinayana, I'm speaking within the context of Tibetan Buddhism. And I think this is a really important distinction to make because they're not the same. I mean, you could only practice the foundational school of Buddhism, and that'd be awesome. It's very valuable. I mean, a strong foundation is what creates. I mean, everything needs a strong foundation. If you're gonna build a building, you need something very strong to get it anywhere. And then there's usually, and then what we call the Mahayana school of Buddhism, which means great vehicle. And this is more focused on what's called the bodhicitta, the development of bodhicitta. And bodhicitta is this desire. It's usually translated as the desire to liberate other beings from cyclic existence. But one way that we could think of it is not as to liberate other beings, but to care for them. Because we can see their pain. And we understand that, well, we got to ask, what are we liberating them from? Who are we liberating? And who am I to say that someone else needs to be liberated? Right? And then we have the Vajrayana path, but I'm not going to talk about the Vajrayana. That's more like tantric practice, as it involves a lot of visualization and energy work. It's what's called yidam deities, yidam practice, which is like you're basically just imagining yourself as a deity in Tibetan Buddhism. But that aside, in going back to the foundational path, we have a general framework. We have a vision of the five skandhas, and we have a general idea of the Baba Chakra, and we have this theory in which we can understand how our ego starts to develop and how we start to separate us from the world. So we have a good intellectual grasp on these things, but we also need to create an experiential understanding of this. And so there's two forms of meditation that is generally started with in Buddhist path. This is shamatha meditation and vipassana meditation. Shamatha translates as the cultivation of peacefulness or peace, cultivation of peace. Vipassana is the cultivation of insight. Vipassana tends to be more popular in the West. And this is largely due to the reconstruction and development of Southeast Asian forms of Theravada Buddhism. A lot of these forms of Buddhism were heavily persecuted by colonialism, and the tradition started to degrade somewhat after quite a while. But there were some monks who did their best to really preserve their culture and save it, and they took it from a purely monastic setting, which the monastics were generally very high class people. You know, you had to be born into a wealthy family to even go to a monastery, because those were the people who were literate. So a few of these monks, they took it from the monastic setting and they brought it to the laity, and they said, this stuff is for everyone, and it can help everyone. It can help all beings escape from the wheel of suffering. And they actually thought that the laity would be the ones to continue on the traditions more than the monastics. And so they kind of got rid of this this first part of the meditation, shamatha. They thought that by cultivating insights, that the peacefulness would come naturally to us. And so I understand that might work for the contexts of their society at the time, but oftentimes I observe when we look at the context of our Western society, that going straight into Vipassana, especially when we're doing our best, when sometimes we're bringing this practice as a form of trauma recovery, it can be hard to go straight into insight meditation, because stuff bubbles up from our unconscious, stuff that we've repressed, stuff that we don't want to experience. It comes back up. And I think there's been a few studies done that have determined that, you know what, Vipassana actually isn't that great for trauma recovery, even if it can be used in some settings. But we look at shamatha, right? This is the cultivation of peace. And so what we're doing with shamatha, it's in the name. We're cultivating a sense of peace. We're creating a strong foundation in which we can then later have insights into the nature of our own being that come up in a way that doesn't shake us, that we can face. And so when we're developing this practice of shamatha, generally we're allowing our thoughts and our feelings to arise and pass. And as we do this, we can start to observe and sense spaces in between our thoughts. A lot of teachers describe our thoughts in our mind as somewhat of a monkey or a bird, actually. Let's use a bird. This bird flies from one branch to the next branch. And it keeps landing. These landing points are our thoughts, but there's spaces in between these branches. And as we develop this practice of shamatha meditation, we can start to abide in these spaces a little bit more. And these spaces, there's a lot of freedom in these spaces. There's the freedom from these constrictive thought patterns. And this can create, it creates a sense of peace. It's a foundation. We start to cultivate this peace. And it's said that shamatha just kind of naturally develops into vipassana. There's no need to generally practice vipassana or practice shamatha. It's more that shamatha gradually turns into vipassana. We start to have insights once we have this foundation. And so to help with this foundation, to have these insights, we cultivate what's called the 4 Brahma Viras. These 4 Brahma Viras, they're concepts, feelings that existed in Brahmanism, but kind of gently bled into Buddhism. And these Brahmaviras, they're also called the 4 immeasurables because they are immeasurable. They can't be measured. They are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So these words are sometimes a little bit tricky because they're Sanskrit words that got translated by Western academics with a Christian background. So when we talk about them, we're somewhat talking about we have a different definition generally. And so what we mean by, well, loving kindness is pretty much there. It's love and kindness. I mean, but when we get to compassion, it's a little bit tricky because sometimes Buddhists call what Westerners conceive of compassion as idiot compassion. Because if we are in such a passive state that we let someone walk all over us, we let someone use us, we're not being compassionate. Because we're not being compassionate to ourselves. What they mean by compassion instead is that there's this desire to wake people up. We see that the world is suffering and we want to end the suffering. So when we're compassionate to beings, we're waking them up from their suffering. But this is done through loving kindness. This loving kindness is very important. I'm talking about equanimity next. Equanimity, what we mean by equanimity is that we start to experience our sensations without a preference to like or dislike. We begin to see our sensations as they are, rather than the conceptions we hold around those sensations. And this is again, one of those ones that's really somewhat easy to understand on an intellectual level, but has a whole different meaning once it's experienced. And it's not easily experienced in my practice. It's hard. I've probably only experienced real equanimity a couple of times. But those were the most, it's hard to speak of them. They're very, like I said, they're very ontological. They're not, but when I did experience them, I felt my pain. And I could see my pain, but I could really see it for what it was. And I could lean into it. But I wasn't suffering from my pain. That was the difference. It was just there. And finally, we have sympathetic joy. And this sympathetic joy is really important because we begin to means we're really happy for other people. Like if someone gets a new job, we're happy. We are genuinely happy. We feel happiness when someone has a new job, when someone else has an accomplishment. And these Brahmaviharas, the cultivation of them, starts to short circuit this egoic cherishing that we generally hold about ourselves. That it starts to short circuit this this idea that we're separate from the rest of the world and that we need to perpetuate this sense of separateness. But they really assist in this foundation, especially the two that I find most kind of that are really close to each other is loving kindness and equanimity. Because when we're meditating, like I said, a lot of this unconscious repressed material starts to bubble up. And it can be painful to see a lot of this stuff. And so we have to find ways to show these things loving kindness. And begin to, the whole practice really is about making friends with ourselves, becoming best friends with ourselves, in fact. Because someone who is truly your best friend will be there with you no matter what you're going through. And so if you can be this for yourself, isn't that great? Like you can go through anything no matter how painful it is, and you can, it's really a special thing to have an intimate relationship with your own being, to see your pain and say, I see you, I care for you, I understand you, and I love you. Right? We don't have to be adverse to our pain. And it's generally thought that our aversion to our pain is what perpetuates our suffering, because we're not allowing ourselves to experience it. And when we experience our pain, we really lean into the felt sense of that pain. Generally, we find that there's no inherently existing identity within that pain. And what I mean by that is that it's temporary. That's another way of saying that it's empty. It's empty of inherent existence. And there's this really interesting model, again, that was come up by John Wellwood. And in this model, it's called the model of felt experience. And I don't know if I remember it too well, but it's generally something like, I have raw aliveness. My raw aliveness is that I feel things. I feel pain. I'm alive. I have sensation, right? And then so we start to have feelings. But our feelings are different from our emotions. Our emotions start to develop when we start to intellectually conceive of our feelings. And so say someone like slapped me on the face, then that's a feeling, and I don't like that. And that might have a feeling of tingling on my face, but I might also have this feeling in my chest of just like hurt, like how could this person do this to me? Like, what a dick, like, my God. But those feelings, I'll start to intellectually conceive of these feelings and be like, why did he do that? Why was I slapped in the face? That makes me feel hurt. It makes me feel bad. And so we oftentimes will replay this in our head. And this intellectual entanglements with our feelings is what is sometimes thought of an emotion. This is one theory of emotion. There's a lot of different theories of emotion. But what I think is very interesting about this is it kind of is reminiscent of the five skandhas. is we start to see this entanglement between feeling and intellect that gives rise to our emotions. And there's this interesting quote that I heard the other day that said that feeling or that emotions are not our reactions to the world, but really they're the way we construct the world around us. But it's when we lean into the felt experience, into our bodily, our somatic experience, that it takes us away from our head. It takes us away from our narratives that we're forming about the world. And we can start to just really have a direct experience of what it's like to be alive, which is, I think it's really cool. Because oftentimes we're not having a direct experience of being alive. We're in our heads. And so that's generally what we see as the foundational techniques of Buddhist meditation. Once we have that well established, generally we begin to practice the cultivation of bodhicitta, which I mentioned earlier is this loving kindness we feel for other beings because we see that they're suffering and we don't want them to suffer. Let me backtrack a little bit. These Brahma Viras, these immeasurables, we cultivate them with our own experience first, right? And once cultivated with our own experience, we then can find it easier to share them with the rest of the world. And this is often done with bodhicitta, the cultivation of bodhicitta, which is mostly the main aspect of the Mahayana school of Buddhism. And there's different techniques of cultivating bodhicitta. Some people tend to just do their sitting meditation and see this cultivation of bodhicitta as part of their sitting practice, whether that's shamatha vipassana or zazen. But we can also, if we want a different experience, if we're having trouble, we can start to train our mind. And in Buddhism, this idea of mind training is really central. And there's all these steps of mind training, but generally this mind training is just, I have my foundational school and then I have my cultivation of bodhicitta, right? And in this, when we're cultivating bodhicitta, we're literally training our minds. Not in just this abstracted concept of mind, but we're actually changing our brain. We're rewiring our brain to think in different ways about the world around us. It's really amazing. We have all these teachings that the Buddha and all of the Buddhist followers developed over centuries and centuries. And then we just get into neuroscience and we see that they were right. They were right. There's not really empirically, we get this empirical evidence. That's what I'm trying to say. We get empirical evidence that they knew what they were talking about. That's really cool. Because with these practices, the neurons in our brains are actually rewiring. They're making new connections. Not going to go too far into neuroscience, but as tempting as it is. So we're with this cultivation of bodhicitta, I use that phrase, we're short-circuiting our egoic conceptions about the world, these structures, because we're changing the dynamic in the relationship that we have to other beings. First, we changed our relationship to our own experience. We changed our relationship to pain to learn how to lean into it, to experience it more fully. But then we change our relationship to the external world, to the world we see around us. And this cultivation of bodhicitta, it really is, there's relative bodhicitta, and there's absolute bodhicitta. And we see this theme of relative and absolutes all the time in Buddhism. It's part of the Mahayana teachings, called the two truths. And these two truths were first expounded by a figure who's considered probably the most important figure in Buddhism next to the Buddha. And he lived around 500 years after the Buddha. His name was Nagarjuna, and he did stuff in India, as you do. He was popular, but he was thought of as like a lazy monk. Like he showed up very late for meditation practice, but he's also one of the most important figures we see. Like, and he developed what we call the two truths, and these are the two truths of the relative and the absolute. That these two things can be true at the same time, because really they're not different. It's our perception of them that makes them different. And what we're doing is we're transmuting our perception. But so we have relative bodhicitta, right? And this is the bodhicitta that we hold for other beings. We hold love and compassion and kindness for other beings. And then we have absolute bodhicitta, which is a very non-dual state of consciousness. That's how it's related. But the way that we get there is through this relative bodhicitta of caring for one another, caring for fellow sentient beings. And one of the methods used to cultivate this bodhicitta is what's called metta practice. And metta just means loving kindness. Is that right, Andrew? Yes. Okay. He's my Sanskrit reference. And so this practice is really interesting because it's mind training. We have all these narratives in our head, right? But when we start to see the spaces between these narratives, that's when we have opportunity. That's when we have potential. We have potential to rest in these spaces, and then we can actually form narratives in our head. We can form new narratives, new ways to conceive about the world that can oftentimes be more enjoyable than the narratives that happen to us. So instead of letting the narrative happen to us, often we can form the narrative. And that's sometimes how I conceive of this set of symbols here. We see this in Zen a lot, and it's the circle, the square, and the triangle. And the circle is the absolute, and the square is the relative. And this is us, we're the triangle. And so we're a bridge between the absolute and the relative. We can exist in both of these places, and we can acknowledge and validate both of these places, but we can draw from the absolute and bring it into the relative. And so generally, this is what I see when practicing metta. And again, this is my interpretation of it, my experience with it. And so this is what I mean by we're creating a new narrative. We're finding the gaps in the narratives that we don't like, and we're replacing it with something new. We're creating new connections in our brain. And so in metta practice, this part's tricky because the contexts of the West are different from the contexts of the East. In Tibet, we always start with the love of the mother. Because our mother is someone who loves us unconditionally. No matter what, our mother will be there to love us. In the West, sometimes we have difficult relationships with our parents. And so when Buddhist teachers started to bring and teach Westerners, they were confused because in Tibet, they don't have a word or set of words for self-loathing or self-hating. They don't have that concept. It's not there in Tibetan. So when they started to encounter Westerners, they were like, oh, Westerners hate themselves. And they were like, what the hell is going on? How am I going to teach them if they're in such like a bad state? And so they kind of had to rework a lot of the teachings to fit the contexts of the West. Yes, yeah. Westerners? That's another talk. Honestly, that's a completely other talk. Yeah. Oh, the question was how did Westerners get into the state of self-hatred? And that's very complex. Generally, some things that contribute to that, speaking very generally here, is we have consumerism, we have Catholic Church, we have industrialization, these general themes. And so, but so so it's hard because in the East, especially with this, we see her right here. This is a statue of Kali, the Hindu goddess Kali. She's Buddhist adjacent, but with Kali, sometimes she's known as Kali Ma, and she's the mother. She's the great mother, and devotees of Kali, they feel loved by Kali, and they have such a devout love for Kali, the mother. And it's this love that starts to dissolve the egoic boundaries between self and other. And I find her a good representation of this, of bodhicitta, of this thing we're cultivating. So I hope that starts to make sense, that that love of the mother, this transcendent love, this transcendent caring. So in metta practice, oftentimes we start with the love of the mother. We invoke that feeling that we have, that our mother has for us, that we feel the love from our mother. We invoke that feeling within us. We feel it, and we visualize ourselves, and we visualize ourselves smiling and being happy. And I made a modification to this practice. Generally in this practice, we say, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be healed, may you be at peace. But I changed this due to some theory that I have from other places and experience from other practices. And I changed the wording to be, I am happy, I am safe, I am healed, and I am at peace. I changed it to work in the present tense because we're working with right now. We're not working for a future imaginary time. We're working, I am happy right now. I'm happy, and I'm safe, and I'm healed, and I'm at peace. And we say this a few times, and then we move over to a teacher or someone we respect, and we do this practice with them. Someone who it's generally easy to have these feelings for. And then we move this practice again to a friend. We generally avoid people whom we are in a romantic relationship with, because we want to be able to distinguish love from desire. And so we do this with a friend. we do this practice with an acquaintance. We do this practice with someone we saw at the person who checked us out at the grocery store, who checked out our groceries. Someone we don't see very often, we don't know at all, almost a complete stranger. And we develop this compassion and this loving kindness for this other being. And then we do this with an enemy. And we begin to develop this loving kindness and compassion for an enemy. And to the Buddhists, the enemy is our greatest teacher, because they're the ones that we really have to practice patience with. And if we can, and the best way to make an enemy, to defeat an enemy, is to make them your friend. That's really the best way to defeat an enemy. And after we've done that, we expand this to all sentient beings. May all sentient beings be happy. May all sentient beings be at peace. May all sentient beings be healed. Sorry, may all sentient beings be safe, and then may all sentient beings be at peace. And so with this practices, it's about the cultivation of it's really the heart space. Sure, we're working with narratives, but we're feeling this in our heart. And another way we cultivate bodhicitta is through getting into touch with our own pain, our original wound, our original suffering. This is sometimes called the tender heart. And getting into touch with our own tender heart, our own wound, and seeing that wound can often allow us to see other people's wound. We can start to identify with other people's suffering and identify with other people's pain, and know that it's not different in any absolute way. That the contexts of what brought about the pain and suffering might be different, but it's a human experience to feel pain. And so we can develop this empathy for other beings and start to sometimes dissolve this object-subject relationship, this self and other relationship. And then I want to talk about another practice finally, to kind of conclude things, to really explain why this talk is called Transcendent Loving Kindness. Is because once we've developed this, and this is really a mind training practice, more so than the other ones. It's what's called Tonglen in Tibetan, and this mind training is, it means, if I'm correct, giving and taking. And so in this final practice that I will touch upon, what we're doing is we're developing that heart space, those feelings. And then we're really imagining that we're breathing in another being's suffering. But what we're doing first, actually, I'm sorry, I should have said this, is we're breathing in our own suffering. And we bring to mind somewhat of a claustrophobic feeling that we've experienced in the past. And we have this in mind, we have this experience that we're remembering, and we take this claustrophobia, this tight constriction that we feel, and we're, in a sense, breathing it into our being. We're starting to get closer to our pain. But then as we exhale, we're breathing out relief from our suffering of that pain. And this practice is interesting because it has to involve a knowledge of emptiness. We have to sense in some way that there is no inherently existing self in which to feel pain or enjoy pleasure. And so as we breathe in the pain for ourselves and we start to develop that practice and exhale relief from that pain and suffering, we can then do this for other beings. And when we do this practice, we're not really believing that we're taking away another being's suffering. That's not really the point. The point is actually very selfish. The point is we're training our mind to interact with our environment in a different way and interact with other beings around us in a different way. And so we do this practice, we inhale another suffering and we see them become happy. We're exhaling this white light of relief from suffering. We're actually giving them our happiness. We're saying, give me your suffering and take my happiness. Take it. Because I don't have an inherently existing self within my being. There's no, what's the word for it, Andrew? I need to reference you again. Inherently existing self. Swabhava. Sure, yeah. So there's no swabhava. There's no Atman. There's on Atman. There's no self. And so we can actually take in an infinite amount of suffering and give an infinite amount of happiness to other beings. And so in this practice, it's really interesting. We can start to sense like how willing are we to inhale someone else's suffering? How big of an inhale will we? How much of it will we inhale, right? Will we, it's interesting to notice these things. And if we can be aware of that, maybe we can be aware of, well, maybe I can take a deeper breath. Maybe I can take on more of someone's suffering. And then we release that happiness to them, right? And we do this for different people. And depending on our relationship with different people, it can bring up different things within us. And eventually, again, it goes into, I'm starting to expand. I'm starting to go, I'm going to inhale the suffering of my community. I'm going to inhale the suffering of all sentient beings eventually. And that's generally the course of the practice. And this practice is really special. It's because like I was speaking on before, it rewires our brain. It changes our relationship to suffering, and it changes our relationship to other beings, to other people we interact with, and other animals, really everything. We start to interact with the world differently. And for me, when I was practicing this, when they were teaching it to me, I was talking to one of my meditation instructors, and he was like, this practice can actually make you sick if you're not doing it properly. And I thought that was interesting. I was like, wow, that's powerful. But for me, when I was doing it, it really led to a big like heart awakening, a big emotional awakening. And I was experiencing this pain in my stomach for a long time. I went to the doctors. They're like, who knows? That tends to be Western medicine. When I did this practice, it kind of released. I felt that pain actually like move and like kind of disperse, and I was like, whoa. And then all these feelings kind of just welled up, and I was like, let all this release. So it's really interesting how our body can hold pain and hold trauma. And yeah, I just it's an incredible practice, and that's why I really wanted to share it with all of you here today. And I thank all of you for listening. to me talk. Yes. Thank you, everyone.